The sheriff's voice carried over the crowd, loud and smug beneath the blazing Sunday. "Go on, boy, choose any woman you want. You earned it." Laughter rippled through the dusty street, rough and cruel. The cowboy stood there, hat low, dust clinging to his boots, eyes shadowed with something deeper than pride. Around him, the women stood frozen, fear, shame, and defiance mixing in their faces. The town waited for his answer, expecting greed, expecting sin. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, and it cut through the noise like a bullet through glass. What he said next silenced every man there and changed the way that town remembered mercy, justice, and love for the rest of its days. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The saloon went still, the kind of silence that pressed down heavy and mean, cutting through the smoke and whiskey like a blade. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The piano man froze mid-note, and the sheriff's grin, slick and easy, a moment before dropped like a mask slipping from a liar's face. The cowboy stood where he was, hat low, dust from the trail still clinging to his coat, the look in his eyes enough to chill the room. "You best watch your tongue, boy," the sheriff said finally, voice tight but low, his hand settling near the butt of his revolver. The cowboy didn't flinch. He took one slow step forward, then another, boots echoing across the floorboards, spurs whispering like a warning. "Ain't a boy," he said, his tone calm, too calm. "Ain't talking wild either. You got something that don't belong to you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, rough voices whispering his name like it was a curse or a prayer. Jonas Harlow, the drifter who'd once run cattle for the widow's late husband, the man who'd buried her kin when no one else dared. Folks said he'd disappeared after the hanging, vanished into the hills with nothing but his grief and his gun. But now he was here, back in town, and every man in that saloon could see what he meant to do. The sheriff straightened, his fingers brushing the steel at his side. "You talking about the widow, Marks?" he asked, his words careful as he weighed the danger. "She broke the law, Jonas. Harboring a fugitive's a hangin' crime." Jonas tilted his head, a ghost of a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth, cold, humorless. "Law's a funny thing," he said. "Depends on who's writing it, and who it's meant to break." Someone coughed near the bar, nervous, and the sound cracked through the tension like a pistol shot. The sheriff's deputies shifted, 3 of them, hands twitching toward their holsters, eyes darting between their boss and the man who stood alone. Outside, thunder rolled low and far, the first warning of an oncoming storm. "You best ride out of here while you still can," the sheriff said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Ain't no sense dying over a woman who made her own bed." Jonas's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe so," he said, "but she ain't the one hanging from it." The words hit hard, a truth sharp enough to draw blood, and for the first time the sheriff looked uncertain. He'd locked the widow up 2 days past for what, nobody rightly knew. Some said she'd hidden her husband's brother after the railmen came for him. Some said she'd spoken too loud against the governor's men. Whatever the reason, the town had watched in silence as the sheriff dragged her through the street, her head high, her wrists bound. Jonas had watched too from the ridge above, rain cutting through the dust, and now here he was, standing in the lion's den. "You got till sundown to walk away," the sheriff said, his voice steady again though his eyes betrayed the flicker of fear. "After that, I can't promise you'll walk at all." Jonas nodded slowly, tipped his hat, then turned toward the door, his spurs ringing like distant thunder. "Don't trouble yourself, Sheriff," he said over his shoulder, voice low but certain. "I'll be back long before sundown." The door swung open, wind howling in from the street, and as he stepped out into the storm brewing over the plains, every man in that saloon knew there'd be blood in the dust before nightfall. The jailhouse smelled of rust, rain, and regret, the kind of place where hope came to die slow, one heartbeat at a time. The widow Marks sat on the cot, her back straight despite the ache in her bones, the dim light from the barred window tracing the edge of her face. Outside, thunder rumbled low, echoing through the hills, and with each growl she felt the world shift closer to reckoning. She had been a woman of grace once, a ranch wife with soft hands and a sharp mind, trusted by all who knew her, even admired by some. Now she was a prisoner in her own town, Her name whispered like poison in the saloons and feed stores, her reputation traded for silence. The sheriff, her late husband's own brother, had seen to that. He'd worn his badge like armor, but she'd learned too late that the man beneath it was nothing more than greed in a uniform. After her husband's death, he'd come calling, his words sweet and careful at first. He said he wanted to help her, that the land was too much for a woman to hold alone. But when she refused to sign over the deed, the kindness turned to steel. He'd warned her, quiet and cold, that some things were better left in a man's hands. She'd laughed then soft but sharp and told him she'd rather die with the land than sell it to a coward. She hadn't realized how serious he was until the day his men rode up with a warrant and a lie. They said she'd stolen gold from the county safe, though everyone knew she'd never set foot near it. They dragged her through the street like a common thief, ignoring the way townsfolk turned their eyes, unwilling to see justice twisted into something mean. The sheriff had done it all with that same smirk he wore when the gallows went up years before, when he'd hanged a man without trial just to make a point. That man had been her husband's brother, too, a drifter accused of killing a lawman's son, though no one ever proved it. She'd begged the sheriff for mercy then, and he'd told her mercy was for those who could pay for it. She'd never forgiven him, and now, here she sat, the storm rising outside, the smell of dust and vengeance thick in the air. She could hear the deputies talking in the next room, their laughter low and cruel. "She'll sign before the week's out," one said. "Ain't no woman that stubborn," the other snorted. "You ain't met this one. She'd burn the deed before giving it up." She smiled to herself, a bitter curl of pride. They were right. The land was all she had left of her husband, of the life they'd built under that wide sky. She wouldn't surrender it to the man who'd destroyed everything good she'd ever known. Still, as the night deepened and the rain began to fall harder, she felt the weight of solitude press down on her. Her fingers traced the locket at her throat, a small silver thing, tarnished now but precious. Inside was a lock of hair, her husband's, and a faded note written in a hand she knew by heart. "If the world turns cruel, hold fast. There's still goodness out there," she wanted to believe it. But goodness was a fragile thing, and cruelty had a way of surviving every storm. Still, as thunder split the sky, something stirred in her, something fierce and fragile all at once. She didn't know yet that Jonas Harlow had spoken her name in the saloon, or that the wind carrying the storm would also carry him back to her. But somewhere deep inside, where fear and faith wrestled for breath, she felt it, that strange, unexplainable certainty that the world had not finished with her yet. The sheriff's boots scraped slow circles in the dust, each step measured, deliberate, a show for the crowd that had gathered under the awning of the jailhouse as the rain broke into a steady, heavy drizzle. He wore his confidence like a weapon, one hand resting near the gun that had made him king of this town, his mouth curling into that familiar smirk, the one that never reached his eyes. "You'd trade your reward for a traitor?" he said, his voice carrying easily over the muttering of onlookers pressed close beneath their hats. The question wasn't meant for an answer. It was a sneer, an accusation, a way to remind everyone who still held power here. But the cowboy didn't flinch. Jonas Harlow stood just beyond the edge of the boardwalk, soaked to the bone, his coat dripping, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much and cared too little until now. He'd ridden straight through the storm, the mud still fresh on his boots, and come face to face with the man who'd twisted justice until it broke. "Ain't here for a reward," Jonas said, his voice low, the kind that carried not through volume but conviction. "Never cared much for the price of blood." The sheriff chuckled, a hard, empty sound that made the hair on the back of a man's neck stand up. "That so?" he said, circling closer, his spurs whispering against the boards. "Funny thing, most men who come looking for trouble don't bother pretending it's about honor. You sure you ain't just sore I got to her first?" The words hit like a slap, and the murmurs from the crowd thickened. Everyone knew what he meant, knew the kind of power a man like the sheriff wielded over those unlucky enough to cross him. Jonas's jaw tightened, the faintest muscle twitching near his temple, but he didn't rise to the bait. He'd learned long ago that rage was a weapon best drawn slow. "You took a woman's land, her name, and her freedom," he said, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the rain. "You call that law? I call it theft." The sheriff's smile faltered, just a flicker, before sliding back into place. "Careful, Harlow," he said softly. "You start questioning the law, and next thing you know, you'll be sitting in that cell right beside her." Maybe I should, Jonas said. Seems like the only honest folks in this town are the ones you lock up. A few of the men in the crowd shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. The sheriff's grip on his revolver twitched, subtle but there. You best ride on, boy, he said, his voice tightening. Before that tongue of yours gets you killed. Jonas took a single step closer, their boots nearly touching now, the air between them thick with tension and rain. You can hang me, Sheriff, he said quietly, but you can't hang the truth. And the truth is, you're afraid. Afraid of the day this town sees you for what you are. For a moment no one moved. Then the sheriff laughed again, but this time there was a brittle edge to it. You always were a fool, Jonas, he said, turning toward the crowd. Tell me, folks, what kind of man throws away his life for a liar and a thief? But the people didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't respect, it was doubt, and the sheriff felt it like a thorn in his side. Jonas tipped his hat, eyes never leaving his enemy. The kind of man, he said, who remembers what decency looks like. Then he turned and walked toward the jailhouse door, his spurs ringing like judgment in the rain, leaving the sheriff staring after him. His smirk gone, his reflection rippling in the puddles at his feet, distorted, cracked, and trembling. The rain had eased to a soft drizzle, but the tension in the street still hung thick enough to choke a man. The townsfolk lingered where they stood, boots sinking into the wet clay, eyes darting between the sheriff and the cowboy like they were watching the first spark of something dangerous and holy all at once. The sound of Jonas Harlow's footsteps fading toward the jailhouse echoed louder than any gunshot, and with each step, the divide in the crowd grew sharper. Damn fool, someone muttered near the saloon, pulling his coat tighter. Ain't no sense throwing your life away for that woman. Sheriff'll hang 'em both by mornin'. But another voice answered, low and steady. Still, the man said, takes guts to stand up to steal. Ain't seen anyone do that since hell. Since her husband. A few heads turned at that, and the name that no one spoke anymore drifted through the murmurs like a ghost, Elias Marks, the man who'd built the widow's ranch and died with his boots on, long before the law turned rotten. The sheriff stood under the awning, jaw tight, eyes cutting through the fog of whispers. He could feel the mood shifting, could sense the fragile line of control beginning to bend. For years, fear had kept this town in his pocket, fear of losing land, fear of losing life, fear of crossing the man with the badge and the gallows rope. But fear, he knew, was a fickle thing. It broke easy once men remembered what courage looked like. He forced a smile and spat into the mud. You folks forget who keeps this place safe? He called out, voice sharp as wire. Ain't a soul here would have a roof or a fence left standin' if it weren't for the law. His deputies nodded, too quickly, and a few townsmen echoed him, but not all. Across the street, by the blacksmith's porch, old Martha Dyer shook her head, her gray hair plastered by the rain. Law ain't the same as justice, Steele, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. You know that better than anyone. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, faint but real. The sheriff's face hardened, the corner of his mouth twitching. Careful now, he warned. Sounds like sedition, comin' from your tongue. But even his voice carried less weight than it had an hour ago. The people had seen something they hadn't in years' defiance. A single man standing up against a machine that had ground them down so long they'd forgotten how to fight back. Jonas Harlow's name was already being whispered like legend, half curse, half prayer. He'll get himself killed, someone whispered near the livery. Maybe, another replied, but at least he's got the guts to try. The sheriff turned his back on them, striding toward the jailhouse with the stiff posture of a man pretending not to feel the fire at his heels. But behind him, the whispers grew, rising, spreading, turning into the quiet hum of something larger than fear. The rain began to fall harder again, each drop hissing against the earth like sparks on dry grass. And though no one dared move against him yet, they all knew the balance had shifted. For the first time in years, the sheriff wasn't the only man in town with power. Jonas Harlow's defiance had lit a fuse, and even if it burned slow, the fire was coming. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the storm rolling back in from the hills, thunder grumbling like the growl of justice waking after a long, bitter sleep. The sheriff's words fell like a hammer on the anvil of the storm, hard and final, echoing through the narrow street where the town had gathered in tense silence. Take her then, he said, his voice carrying over the soft hiss of rain, the mockery gone, replaced by something colder resignation laced with venom. But you're both outlaws now. The crowd shifted uneasily, boots scuffing in the mud, eyes flicking between him and the cowboy standing motionless at the jailhouse door. Jonas Harlow didn't answer right away. He'd come expecting a fight, a showdown that would end in blood and dust. But this was worse. Mercy offered like a trap. Freedom wrapped in threat. The sheriff's grin was back now, small and thin, as if he'd just outplayed them both without firing a shot. Don't say I never gave you a choice, Steele added, stepping aside, his hand resting easy on the iron bars. Go on then, cowboy. Take your lady saint and ride out. But the second you cross that ridge, you're mine. Ain't no lawman alive who'll give you quarter. Jonas's gaze was steady, unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the war behind his silence. Slowly, he reached for the keys hanging on the wall, the metal cold against his calloused fingers. The cell door creaked open with a sound like time itself breaking, the hinges stiff from disuse. Inside, the widow Marks rose from the cot, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly, though her eyes burned steady with disbelief. For a moment, she just stared at him, unable to speak, as if she couldn't quite trust what was happening. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her voice raw from sleepless nights and swallowed tears. There's no walking away from this. Jonas met her gaze, his expression softening just enough to show the truth beneath the grit. Ain't walking away, he said quietly. Just taking back what's mine to protect. The words caught her like a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding, and for the first time in weeks, a spark of life flickered behind her tired eyes. He held out his hand, and though her wrists still bore the faint marks of the shackles, she took it without hesitation. Together, they stepped out into the street. The rain had slowed to a mist, thin and silver in the afternoon light, and the crowd parted without a sound, their faces torn between awe and fear. Some looked away, unwilling to defy the badge still glinting on the sheriff's chest. Others watched openly, their hearts stirring with something dangerous admiration. The widow's bare feet sank into the mud, her skirt torn, her hair matted with damp, but she walked tall beside the cowboy, her hand gripping his arm like a lifeline. You're a fool, Harlow, the sheriff called after them, his tone smooth again, but his eyes hard. You think you can fight what's coming? Every mile you ride, there'll be a rope waitin'. Jonas didn't turn, didn't look back. Then I'll die ridin', he said simply, his voice low but steady enough for all to hear. Better than livin' under a man like you. A murmur rolled through the onlookers, half gasp, half cheer, and the sheriff's jaw twitched. He took a step forward, but something in the air stopped him, that charged stillness of a moment too late to undo. The cowboy and the widow moved toward the edge of town, their figures blurring in the rain as if the world itself couldn't quite decide whether to erase them or remember them forever. Behind them, the people began to talk again, low, urgent, uncertain, and the sheriff stood alone before his jailhouse, the keys still swinging gently from the door, the echo of freedom ringing louder than the storm that followed. The sun was sinking low, bleeding red across the rim of the desert as Jonas and the widow rode hard into the open wild. The sound of their horses pounding against the dry earth like a heartbeat refusing to die. Behind them, the town lay small and shrinking, its outline swallowed by the shimmer of heat and dust, a memory already fading into myth. They didn't speak, not yet, for there was no room for words in the breathless rhythm of escape. The sheriff's threat still hung in the air like smoke, and every gust of wind carried the ghost of pursuit. The trail stretched endless before them, the land flat and cruel, painted in gold and shadow. She clung to the saddle, her hair whipping loose, her skirt torn at the hem, and for the first time in months she felt the sting of the wind on her face, sharp, alive, honest. Freedom wasn't soft or kind. It was wild and biting, a force that stripped everything false from the soul. Still, she welcomed it, the pain of it, the truth of it. The weight that had pressed on her chest for so long was lifting now, replaced by the rush of something she hadn't dared to feel in years' hope. Jonas rode beside her, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set, his hands steady on the reins. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He could feel the danger behind them like a second shadow, Could almost hear the sheriff's voice carried faintly on the wind. "You're both outlaws now." He'd known the cost before he ever set foot in that jailhouse. Known there was no turning back once he opened that cell door. But seeing her now, alive, breathing, her spirit not yet broken, he couldn't regret it. The desert was a hard place, but it was honest, and he'd take that over the lies of town life any day. As they crested a ridge, the last light of day spilled across the valley below miles of cracked earth, dry riverbeds, and sagebrush glinting silver in the fading Sunday. Somewhere out there was safety, or at least distance, and that was enough. "How far do we ride?" she asked finally. Her voice carried on the wind. Jonas glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into something close to a smile. "Far as it takes," he said. She nodded, her fingers tightening on the reins. She had no home left, no name worth keeping, but the world ahead was wide and unwritten, and that was more than she'd dared dream. The sky deepened to violet, stars just beginning to wake, and as they rode, the air grew cooler, the scent of rain lingering somewhere far behind. For a fleeting moment, she let herself believe they might outrun it all, the law, the past, the pain. She looked over at Jonas, his silhouette dark against the dying light, and wondered what it was that kept him going. Duty, guilt, love, or something older, wilder, buried deep beneath the years. Whatever it was, she knew it now bound her to him, as surely as chains once had, but in a way that didn't confine it, steadied. The town might call them outlaws, but out here, in the vast hush of the desert, they were something else entirely, survivors of a cruel world, carving out a place where truth still meant something. The wind rose suddenly, carrying sand and the scent of sage, and she closed her eyes, letting it sting her cheeks. Freedom, she realized, wasn't peace, it was movement. It was pain. It was the fierce, trembling joy of being alive despite everything that tried to stop you. And as the last trace of daylight slipped beneath the horizon, she smiled for the first time in months. A small, real thing that no lawman could ever take away. The desert night closed around them like a living thing, vast and unrelenting, the stars burning cold and hard above the jagged rim of the canyon. Jonas led the horses down the narrow trail, their hooves clattering softly against the stone, each sound swallowed by the deep, echoing hush. Behind them, somewhere beyond the dunes and dark hills, came the faint, rhythmic thunder of pursuit, the sheriff's posse riding hard, their lanterns flickering like ghostly fire in the distance. The widow's breath came quick and shallow, the exhaustion of the ride written in the tremble of her hands. But she said nothing. She trusted him now, the way one trusts the last light before nightfall. They reached a hollow at the canyon's base where a dry creek bed curved around a wall of rock, half hidden by thorn bush and shadow. Jonas dismounted, his every movement deliberate, practiced. "We'll stay here till morning," he said, his voice low, roughened by dust and silence. She nodded, sliding down from her saddle, wincing as her feet met the ground. The canyon air was sharp and cold, smelling of stone and rain long gone, and above them, the wind moaned through the cliffs like a warning. She shivered, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked softly. Jonas shook his head, checking the sky where the faint orange glow of distant torches bled into the horizon. "Not till one of us is in the ground." He didn't say which one. He crouched near the horses, unstrapping the rifle from his saddle, the metal glinting pale in the starlight. Each bullet slid into place with the soft, steady rhythm of a heartbeat, and with every click, the silence between them grew heavier. The widow knelt nearby, her eyes following his hands. "You've done this before," she said. "Too many times." He paused, the ghost of a bitter smile crossing his face. Too many, and never enough. For a while, they said nothing more. The night was alive with sound, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through dry grass, the restless creak of leather as the horses shifted. Somewhere high above, an owl cried, its call breaking the stillness like a shot. The widow drew closer to the fire Jonas had built, small and low, its glow just enough to see by, not enough to give them away. "When this is over," she said quietly. "What then?" Jonas stared into the flame, his expression unreadable. "If we live through dawn," he said, "we'll figure out the rest." She wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine some world beyond the chase fields, sunlight, Laughter that didn't end in fear, but the desert didn't promise futures, only choices. And Jonas had already made his. He moved to the canyon's edge, peering into the dark where the trail curved out of sight. He could sense them coming, the slow, patient rhythm of killers who thought themselves righteous. Steele's men weren't fast, but they were thorough, and Steele himself was a man who didn't forgive defiance. The sheriff would ride at the front, calm and sure, his smile carved from cruelty and certainty. Jonas knew the kind men who hid behind the law like it was armor. He'd killed men like that before. The widow rose and joined him, her hand brushing his arm. "You could leave me," she said, her voice barely above the wind. "Save yourself." Jonas turned to her, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Ain't in me to leave what's worth saving." For a long moment, they stood there together, the canyon wind cold against their faces, the fire's glow flickering against the stone. When the first coyotes began to howl again, distant and mournful, Jonas loaded the last round into his rifle and rested it across his knees. The sound of hooves was closer now, faint but clear, echoing through the dark like a heartbeat that didn't belong to them. He glanced toward the horizon, where the stars were paling at the edges. Dawn was coming, and with it, the blood he'd been waiting for. The first light of dawn split the canyon in bands of red and gold, painting the cliffs of Red Mesa like blood poured across stone, and in that terrible beauty, the gunfire began. The posse came down hard from the ridge, 6 men, rifles glinting, voices sharp and cruel in the thin morning air. Jonas was waiting for them. He'd moved before sunrise, choosing the high ground where the rocks bent inward like a shield. The widow crouched behind him, her breath ragged, her face streaked with dust and tears, but her eyes steady. "Stay low," he told her, his voice calm, too calm. "When I tell you, you ride east. Don't look back." She shook her head, refusing, but there was no time for argument. The first shot cracked the silence, splintering the stone beside them. Jonas returned fire instantly, the report echoing through the canyon, the smell of gunpowder mingling with the cold desert air. Below, the sheriff's men fanned out, using the rocks for cover, their voices calling to each other, mocking, confident. "You can't win this, Harlow," one shouted. "You're one man against the law." Jonas reloaded, his movements smooth and sure. "Ain't law I'm fightin'," he muttered, sighting down the barrel. "It's what's left of my conscience." He fired, and one of the riders tumbled from his saddle, a dark shape crumpling in the dust. The widow flinched but didn't scream. She'd seen death before, but this was different. This was a man laying down his life not for glory or vengeance, but for something purer, something she barely understood. Another shot rang out, grazing Jonas's shoulder. He staggered, gritted his teeth, and steadied his aim. The echoes rolled through the canyon like thunder, each bullet a heartbeat, each heartbeat a reckoning. The sheriff's voice cut through the din, cold and certain. "You can't save her, boy. She's marked. The world don't forgive women like her or men like you." Jonas's laugh came low, harsh, defiant. "Then we'll make our own world." He broke cover, moving down the slope with the deliberate grace of a man who'd already made peace with death. The widow wanted to call out, to stop him, but something in his stride held her silent, something sacred in his resolve. Dust kicked up around him as bullets tore through the air, biting into stone and flesh alike. He fired as he moved, precise and merciless, his rifle, an extension of his will. One man dropped, then another. The canyon roared with chaos, the scent of blood and iron thick as the morning sun turned the cliffs a deeper crimson. The sheriff rode forward, revolver drawn, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're saving her?" he spat. "You're just another fool dying for a woman who ain't worth the dirt she walks on." Jonas's answer was a single shot. It struck the sheriff's hat clean off his head, grazing his temple. For a moment, the man blinked, stunned, not hurt enough to die, but enough to see the fear he'd long buried in others reflected back at him. Jonas stood tall in the open, rifle empty now, blood running down his arm, the sun at his back like a halo of fire. "Ain't about worth," he said, his voice ringing clear through the smoke. "It's about right." The sheriff fired once. Twice Jonas dropped to one knee, pain tearing through him, but before the lawman could line up another shot, the widow's hand rose, steady as iron. She had found his spare pistol in the dirt. Her first shot went wide, but the second found its mark. The sheriff's gun slipped from his grasp, his body falling slow and silent into the red dust. The world held still then, only the wind moving, whispering through the rocks like a prayer. Jonas turned toward her, chest heaving, eyes soft with something like awe. The fight was over. The blood was theirs to bear, but the weight of fear had lifted. For the first time in years, the sun rising over Red Mesa didn't feel like judgment, it felt like deliverance. The dust settled slowly over Red Mesa, drifting through the wounded light of dawn like smoke from a dying fire. The gunfire had gone quiet, leaving only the moan of the wind and the labored breaths of the fallen. The sheriff lay half-buried in the dirt, his badge glinting dull beneath a smear of blood, his revolver empty, his pride bleeding out beside him. He tried to stand, his hand trembling as he reached for the weapon, but Jonas was already there, boots planted firm, rifle lowered but steady, his eyes dark and steady as judgment itself. The widow stepped past him, her skirts heavy with dust, her face pale and streaked with the remnants of fear turned to resolve. The sheriff's gaze lifted to her, disbelief mingling with the first flicker of shame. "You think you've won?" he rasped, his voice ragged as the desert wind. "There ain't no winning against the law. Folks'll come for me. They'll come for you." She stopped in front of him, close enough that her shadow fell across his broken form. "The law?" she said quietly. "You mean your law, the kind that kills and calls it order?" Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of years. Every humiliation, every stolen piece of her life condensed into a voice too soft to be denied. The sheriff spat into the dirt, the motion weak, defiant to the end. "You don't have it in you," he said, half daring, half begging. "Go on. Finish it." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Jonas shifted slightly behind her, his finger brushing the trigger, ready to end what the world had started. But the widow raised a hand, stopping him. "No," she said, her eyes never leaving the man before her. "Death's too easy for men like him." She knelt then, not in pity but in power, her face close enough that he had to meet her eyes. "You wanted me small, quiet, forgotten. You wanted my land, my name, my will. But look at you now, nothing left to take." She reached down, tore the badge from his chest, and let it fall into the dirt beside him. The sound it made was soft, but it rang through the canyon like thunder. The sheriff's breath hitched, the reality of his defeat sinking deeper than any bullet could reach. He looked up at her, eyes wide, not from pain but from the weight of something he hadn't felt in years, shame. Around them, the surviving posse members, those who hadn't fled, watched in stunned silence, the reflection of his cruelty mirrored in their faces. They had followed him for power, for coin, for fear. Now all they saw was a man brought low by the truth. The widow stood, the morning light catching her hair, turning the dust to gold around her. "You'll live," she said softly, "and every day you'll wake knowing mercy spared you when justice should have claimed you." She turned to Jonas then, her eyes soft but steady, and for the first time since the jailhouse, he saw peace in them, not joy, not triumph, but release. "Let's go," she said simply. He nodded, slinging his rifle over his shoulder, his bloodied hand brushing hers as they walked past the broken lawman. The sheriff watched them go, his breath coming shallow, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The townsman who'd once called him protector stepped closer, looking down at him with something colder than hatred recognition. He'd built his rule on fear, but now the spell was broken. The truth laid bare in the red dust. As the sun climbed over the cliffs, its light fell across the tarnished badge half buried at his side, gleaming once more before the wind covered it with sand. The sheriff turned his face away, unable to bear the sight. For the first time in his life, he understood what power truly meant, to have it stripped away by mercy, to live long enough to feel the weight of his own sins. And in that cruel, perfect silence, he wept not for the law, but for the man he'd let it make him. When they rode back into town, the dust of weeks on the trail clinging to their coats and the desert sun turning their faces hard and brown, the air felt different, cleaner somehow, quieter, as though the wind itself was holding its breath. The main street was still the same stretch of dirt and shadow, but the eyes that watched from porches and windows were changed. No one jeered, no one spat, no one called them outlaws now. The same townsfolk who'd once crossed the street to avoid the widow marks now stood still, their hats in hand, uncertain and humbled. The cowboy, Jonas Harlow, sat tall in the saddle, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, though the lines around his eyes spoke of miles and battles and sleepless nights. Beside him, the widow rode straight-backed, her hair tied loose, the color of honey darkened by dust, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if daring the town to challenge her right to belong. The sheriff was gone ridden east after his reckoning, they said, stripped of badge and pride alike, leaving behind an empty office and a town unsure how to begin again. The people had lived too long under his shadow, afraid to speak, afraid to stand, and it took seeing one man's defiance and one woman's courage to remind them that fear only rules when hearts stay silent. As Jonas dismounted in front of the general store, the blacksmith was the first to step forward, wiping his hands on his apron, his face solemn. "Didn't reckon we'd see you again," he said quietly. Jonas met his gaze, neither proud nor apologetic. "Didn't reckon you'd want to." The blacksmith nodded slowly, then looked to the widow. "We was wrong," he said simply. "All of us." No grand apologies followed, no cheers or shouts of praise. Just nods, slow and solemn, passing through the crowd like a ripple through still water. The widow dismounted, her boots sinking softly into the dust. She looked around at the faces she'd known all her life, the women who'd gossiped about her, the men who'd turned their backs, and saw, for the first time, something unspoken shining there: respect. She didn't need their words. The silence was enough. It was honest. "We're not here to stir trouble," Jonas said, his voice even but firm. "Just to build again." And build they did. The weeks turned into months, the town learning to breathe without its old tyrant, the land softening under the rhythm of honest work. Jonas helped repair fences, dig wells, tame wild horses. His quiet presence became part of the place, steady as the windmills creak in the morning. The widow reopened her ranch with her own hands, the earth turning rich under her care. Folks began to visit again, at first out of curiosity, then out of gratitude, and finally out of friendship. The fear that had once chained the town began to fade, replaced by something rarer, gentler: decency. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew that the town's redemption had started the day two outlaws chose mercy over vengeance. Sometimes, at dusk, the pair would sit on the porch of the rebuilt house, the horizon burning gold, the cattle lowing in the distance. Jonas would tip his hat back, watching the sun melt into the plains, and the widow would rest her hand over his. No words, no promises, just the quiet knowing that they had both been broken by the same world and had chosen, against all odds, to mend. Love came softly between them, not in thunder or fire, but in the slow rhythm of shared work, shared peace, and the steady faith that goodness like the land could heal if given enough time. And so, as the wind moved through the prairie grass and the stars rose over a town learning how to stand tall again, the legend of the outlaw and the widow became not one of violence, but of grace, the kind of grace that outlasts fear and leaves behind something stronger than law: the simple, enduring mercy of love.